ครับสวัสดีทุกคนนะครับก็สวัสดีทุกท่านที่อยู่ทางบ้านแล้วก็อยู่ณตึกกิจกรรมสโมสรนิสิตรัฐศาสตร์นะครับวันนี้ก็เป็นความยินดีอย่างยิ่งนะครับที่จะเชิญทุกท่านมาร่วมในซีรีส์นะครับของเราในครั้งที่5นะครับซีรีส์ไกลกะลานะครับหรือว่า Beyond Boundaries ครั้งนี้เราก็ได้โอกาสจากนักวิชาการที่มีชื่อเสียงระดับโลกก็คือดร.ฟรานซิส ฟุกุยาม่านะครับซึ่งเป็นผู้เขียนหนังสือโด่งดังไม่ว่าจะเป็นเรื่องจุดจบของประวัติศาสตร์แล้วก็เรื่องระเบียบเสรีนิยมและล่าสุดก็เกี่ยวกับเรื่องอัตลักษณ์นะครับซึ่งเป็นหนังสือที่ controversial พอสมควรเลยทั้งในโลกตะวันตกแต่ว่าอาจจะมีการพูดถึงไม่มากเท่าไหร่ในประเทศไทยครั้งนี้เราจะพาเขามาคุยกับเราวิเคราะห์กับเราถึงสถานการณ์ทางการเมืองสหรัฐอเมริกานะครับหลังยุคของโดนัลด์ทรัมป์ไม่รู้ว่าเป็นหลังยุคโดนัลด์ทรัมป์จริงหรือเปล่าต้องคอยฟังจากดร.ฟุกุยาม่าแล้วก็จะพูดถึงปัญหาเรื่องประชาธิปไตยปัญหาทางสถาบันทางการเมืองที่กำลังเกิดวิกฤตในทั่วโลกนะครับ So hello good morning everybody as a president of Political Science Student Union Chulalongkorn University I'm very welcome all of you to our Beyond Boundaries series throughout this year until the end of our presidency term we will invite speakers around the world academics activists politicians to talk about various issues which are facing us today both as a national citizen and global citizen today we have Professor Francis Fukuyama with us. He's the political scientist professor at Stanford University, and he has written many books, including his latest, Identity, the Demand for Dignity and Politics of Resentment, in which he discussed the difference between identity politics and the rise of populism. So I think, shall we start now? I will give our panel to my colleagues.
Hello, Fukuyama.
Yes, hi, how are you?
Oh, fine. Yeah, okay. So
I'll give an introduction in about a minute.
Okay.
So thank you all for joining us today at Faculty of Political Science, Chulalongkorn University. We are highly honored to be joined by Professor Francis Fukuyama. My name is Rajapong, and besides me is Supanat and Nathawit. So the three of us will be a moderator for today's sessions. So as my colleagues already introduced Professor Fukuyama, he's one of the most renowned political scientists in the world right now. And right now he's a professor at Stanford University. He has written many books, including his latest, Identities, the Demand for Dignity and Politics of Resentment, in which he discusses the relationship between identity politics and the rise of populism. But before we get to the talk, for those of you who have questions for Professor Fukuyama, we'll have the Q&A sessions toward the end of the talk. So if you're watching on Facebook Live, please type your questions in the comment sections and we'll have start picking the questions. Okay. So shall we start then? Are you ready for Professor?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, as some kind of ritual, it's impossible for us to talk about politics without talking about US politics right now. So the US election then. So it's now clear that Joe Biden will be the next president of the United States. Well, to me and to your pleasure, I guess. So after 4 years of Trump administration, democracy and liberalism has been on a decline. Trump has manipulated democratic institutions to his own political gain, resulting in the erosion of trust in democratic institutions. So even when it's clear now that he had lost, he still refuses to concede his elections, and it's hard now to think about a peaceful transition of powers. So, but if nothing goes wrong, Biden will be sworn in as the next president in January, and his first task will be to undo the damage Trump has done for the past 4 years. So I want a broad question then what do you think about the democracy in the post-Trump era and how can Biden fix it?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. I actually have a number of questions for you about what's happening in Thailand, but maybe we can get to that later. So I think we first need to understand what the problem was with the Trump administration. In most normal democratic politics, different political parties disagree about policies. And so Republicans typically want lower taxes, Democrats want higher ones. They have different positions on the environment, on trade, on a lot of different issues. But I think that the problem with Trump was not that he was pushing the wrong policies. I disagree with many of the policies that he was pushing, like cutting off refugees and taking a very harsh stance towards immigrants. But I think the real problem with his administration was something different, because what he was doing was really undermining basic American institutions. In a properly functioning democracy, you have a state which exercises power that's usually residing in the executive branch, but you have other institutions like the rule of law, the judiciary, and democratic elections that put constraints on that kind of executive power. And one of the things that Trump did was to try to undermine those institutions that were constraining him. And so anytime he ran into an obstacle, like his own Justice Department or the FBI or the intelligence community or the court system, he would try to attack it and destroy its legitimacy in the eyes of its followers. And in fact, that's what he's doing right now. He lost the election. He doesn't want to admit that he lost it. And so he is simply making up total falsehoods about how the election was fraudulent, how it was manipulated, how he really won, how the Democrats cheated. All of these things are completely false. But he actually doesn't really care about the impact that this will have in the long run on Americans' belief in their own democratic institutions. What he cares about is simply remaining in power. And so that's the issue, I think. You had a deeply anti-institutional president that, for the purpose of short-term gain, was willing to erode confidence in institutions. Now, this also had a big international impact, because the United States is a global power. It sets an example for many other countries. Trump, I think, undermined that moral authority because the United States, although it's been inconsistent and oftentimes hypocritical, has tried to support democratic countries that were trying to improve their democratic performance, and has opposed dictatorships and authoritarian states. And Trump, took the opposite position. He developed a good relationship with Vladimir Putin in Russia, with Xi Jinping, with Kim Jong-un, and he spent a lot of time attacking leaders of other democracies like Justin Trudeau or Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, and so forth. And he also, I think, was trying to undermine international institutions. There was a widespread fear that if he won a second term, he would destroy NATO by pulling American troops out of Germany and out of Europe entirely, and would also weaken the alliances that the United States has with Japan and with South Korea. And so it would have a big impact internationally. So with the election of Biden, that's not going to happen. I think the biggest impact will be in foreign policy, because Biden is committed to returning the United States to these international organizations like the World Health Organization or the Paris Climate Accords. He's a supporter of NATO. He is a supporter of all of the traditional American allies. And instead of praising Vladimir Putin, I think he's going to be much more critical. And so in that respect, I think there's going to be a shift. The policy towards China, I think, is a little bit different because there, the hostility that has emerged between the US and China, I think, is not just a matter of President Trump's personal preferences. I think that because of the way that China has evolved since Xi Jinping took over in 2013, I think almost any American president is going to have a more confrontational relationship with China. However, I think that the United States under Joe Biden is also going to take what I regard as a more sensible approach, because if you're going to try to block China from human rights abuses or from expansion in the South China Sea, or other things that China is likely to do, you need to have allies and friends. And Trump, was perfectly happy to attack American allies at the same time that he was attacking China. For example, with Huawei, the telecoms company, Trump didn't want Huawei to succeed, but he was so belligerent and so crude in his attacks on China that I think many other democratic countries were reluctant to cooperate with that because Trump had made himself quite unpopular. So obviously that's something that Biden will do differently. The problem, however, I think, is that the United States is still a severely polarized country. I think in Thailand, you have a good understanding of what it means to be polarized, with the red shirts and yellow shirts. And I think something like that has emerged in the United States, except the colors are different. For us, it's red and blue. And I think that has weakened our ability to respond as a nation to emergencies like the COVID pandemic, because the response itself has become highly politicized. So if you're a conservative, you don't want to wear a mask, you don't want to follow instructions for social distancing. But if you're a Democrat, you do the opposite. And that's obviously not a very good way to meet a national emergency. So in that respect, I think Biden is going to have trouble governing because he is going to have a hostile Senate. It looks like the Republicans are going to retain control of the Senate, and therefore it's going to be very hard for him to pass legislation. So I'm concerned about whether he will actually be effective as president after January 20th.
All right, thank you for your answer, and it's very insightful for us and it is related to our situation in Thailand. As you talked about the polarization both in Thailand and US, and from the election result, it turns out that more people of color have come out to vote for Trump, despite the fact that the Democratic Party has spent the last 4 years berating Trump as a racist. They even chose the Indian African American Kamala Harris as the vice president, and to some extent, identity politics has failed. You may or may not agree with this statement. Previously, you have expressed doubt with this kind of identity politics the Democrats are playing, and you seem to be right. If we look at the election result, so the focus on identity politics did not attract voters as the Democrats has hoped. So what is your reflection on this phenomenon?
Well, first of all, we need to talk about what identity politics is. Identity politics has to do with solidarity among identity groups that are usually defined by some fixed characteristic like ethnicity or race or gender. Sometimes it could be sexual orientation. There are other ways of identifying with other people. And I think that it's understandable that people want to identify with people who are similar to themselves. It builds solidarity and it allows for them to mobilize and to take action against injustices. And most of the identity groups that exist are ones that are marginalized or mistreated in some sense. And so they want to push back against that and support their own rights and dignity. The problem, I think, with the way that identity politics has played out in the United States and in Europe and in other countries is that the advocates of an identity believe that the identity is the single most important thing about a person. So therefore, if you are white, it means that you believe in white supremacy, that you take the interests of white people as a group as the most important thing. And conversely, if you're a black person, your racial solidarity is the most important. And that's not true for anybody. I mean, every person is a complex mixture of identities in which their skin color, their religion, their gender are one of many attributes. And you can easily be a black person that still worries about crime in black neighborhoods. And therefore you want, strong police action to protect, your family. And I think the mistake that many Democrats made was to believe that this kind of, racial identity or ethnic identity was by itself enough to make non-white people vote for Democrats. And it turned out, one of the biggest groups that voted surprisingly in favor of Trump were Hispanic people from Latin America. That was surprising because he'd made such a big stand against immigration, especially immigration from Mexico and from Central America. And yet a lot of those people voted for Trump. Now, let's not get carried away. I mean, a majority of them did vote for Biden, but more people in that category voted for Trump in 2020 than in 2016, despite all of the things that he had said in the previous 4 years. And I think that just shows that for many Hispanic people, being Hispanic is not the most important thing about them. They can be Hispanic and conservative. They can, for example, a lot of the Cubans and Venezuelans were fleeing socialist regimes, and they didn't like the idea that the Democrats were talking about socialism. A lot of people resented the kind of political correctness on the part of the Democrats in the way that, for them, race and gender are the most important issues and are, more important than anything else. And, a lot of ordinary people, including a lot of non-white people, just don't think that's true. They think that, it's an issue, but it's not the most important. And, quite frankly, look, my family 2 generations ago or 3 generations ago actually came from Japan. And so I'm a Japanese American. But when I get up in the morning, I don't think to myself, oh, as a Japanese American, I believe, X, or as a Japanese American, I intend to vote, this way because I think that's in the best interest of other Japanese Americans. I just don't think that way. I think of myself as a citizen. I'm a Democrat. I have policy preferences. I'm influenced by certain people, and my particular ethnic background is really not at all relevant to the way that I'm going to vote or think or make choices. And so I think that's really the mistake that a lot of people involved in identity politics make, is thinking that these identities are really the thing that defines people, when it's really not.
So thank you, professors. Next, I want to move to Thai politics then. So far we have been talking a lot about the country where democracy has already been well established. So I want to shift our conversation to the democratic transitions in the place that is undemocratic society. So as you may already know that we are in Thailand, we are still fighting for democracy, even right now. So we actually was at the forefront of democracy in the late 90s, but then we suffer a lot of democratic setback. We suffer from a series of coup and elections, and then a cycle of coup and election again. Whereas Myanmar is steering toward democracy, we are going the opposite way. So I think this is what a lot of Thai people want to know about. Want to know from you, what will be a democratic transition in this period of democratic deficit look like, and under what conditions or how it could be achieved?
Okay, thank you. Well, as I said, I actually want to learn from you because it's my firm opinion that an outsider, a foreigner, really cannot give significant advice to anybody living in a different country because foreigners simply do not have remotely enough knowledge about the actual conditions there. I've been following your struggles, the student protests that have been taking place against the current government. I think that it's very inspiring to see students being willing to take risks of that sort and to stand up against authoritarian rule. And I wish you the best in that. The only thing I can say is just a little bit about how you win these kinds of revolutions. All revolutions start with a mobilization, and that's been happening in Thailand with young people, because it looks like the preferences of younger people in Thailand are really quite different from older ones, and that's important. The big problem with most mobilizations against a dictatorship is twofold. First, there isn't oftentimes an effort to broaden the base of the coalition. If you want to actually defeat a dictatorship, it takes political power. And what that means is you need to organize, you need to organize yourself, people who are like you, but you also need to build a coalition, meaning that you need to get other groups together that don't necessarily have the same agenda that you do, but are willing to work together for, a short-term goal like, restoring democracy to Thailand. And in your case, one of the obstacles to that is, I think, the basic social division that exists in your country, where you have one group of people, and I suspect most of you students are in this group, are middle class. You're educated, you're more aware of what's going on in the outside world. I assume you're in Bangkok right now, so you're in a big city. There's another part of Thailand that is very different. And that was really, I think, the difference between the red shirts and the yellow shirts, because, Thaksin's support base, if you look sociologically, was really this rural population of less educated Thais that had not been reached by, some of the mainstream, the more traditional parties. And that remains still an important constituency. As I've looked at other efforts at democratic revolutions, in Russia, in Ukraine, in Georgia, in the Arab world, this is very frequently the problem, that more liberal reformers who don't like dictatorship oftentimes don't know how to reach out to other groups that potentially could support them. And so that's one issue, is how do you understand other groups that are not like you, and how do you reach out to them, and how do you make a coalition? The other big problem with democratic transitions has been a question of governance, because it's not enough simply to win power by toppling a dictatorship. What we've seen, unfortunately, in many cases, this happened in in Egypt, in Russia, in many other countries, you get rid of a dictator, but then you don't have good knowledge of how to actually exercise power yourself. You don't know how to govern a country, and therefore you make a lot of mistakes. Well, let's take a case in the Arab Spring. One of the only Arab countries to actually remain more or less a democracy after the Arab Spring is Tunisia. So Tunisia got rid of Ben Ali, the dictator. He had to flee the country. There were elections, and there have been elections regularly ever since 2011. But the successor government has not been very good at promoting economic growth, at getting jobs, at reducing especially the very high level of youth unemployment. And so right now, Tunisia is in a very troublesome state. I worry very much whether democracy is going to survive there, because the democratically elected government is seen by most people as corrupt and ineffective and not knowing what to do. And so I think that it's important to also be aware of the challenges that will exist once a dictatorship departs, and to start thinking about what kinds of specific policies and goals you would want to pursue if you got to the point where you actually were in power. And again, this is something that a lot of student movements have a lot of energy and ambition, but because you're relatively young, you haven't had this kind of experience of actually exercising power, and so it's not something that many students are familiar with. And so that's another reason, I think, for building the need to build friends and allies and a coalition together with people that do have some clear ideas about policy goals and the requirements of actually governing a country.
So thank you. So I want to follow up questions. Previously you mentioned about polarization in our country too. Like in the past 10 years, we have red shirt and the yellow shirt. But right now, all the conflicts has evolved into the royalists versus the protesters. So it seems that it's impossible for us to reach any consensus about what our country is going to do next. So this reflects the trends of global trends of polarizations. So how can we fix these polarizations? How can a society reach a consensus about what would be to do with our country?
Well, I think it would be good. There's a large literature on democratic transitions that was written in the 1990s and the 2000s as a result of the transitions in Eastern Europe and in Latin America. So, if you look at that literature, there are several different paths towards a transition. But one of the things I think that comes through is that you don't reach it by consensus. When you're severely polarized, you're not going to get to the point where everybody is going to agree on a new path forward. Really, you have to defeat the authoritarian forces, but the way you defeat them is not by force or simply overpowering them. It almost always depends on there being splits within the existing ruling coalition. Between hardliners and softliners, or people that are more willing to compromise and those that are less willing to. And unless those splits exist, if there's a simple, unified front on the part of the authoritarian forces, it's very, very difficult to dislodge them. And so a lot of the strategy has to be about how do you split off, potential supporters within that coalition and come to some kind of agreement, about some kind of a transition. But as I said, I don't know nearly enough about Thailand to give you, beyond that kind of general observation, to give you any very specific advice about where you should go at this point.
Oh, thank you. One more question is about Thai politics. In 2018, you write argue against identity politics in foreign affairs, and in that article you proposed the concept of creedal national identities to replace the traditional identity politics based on ethnicity. But what do I have? I can say that in Thailand we have this kind of identities. Whether you're Thai or you're a Chinese descendants, if you love the nations, if you love religions, if you love the monarchy, you would be called. You can be Thai. Anyone could be Thai. Then, so what do you say if your creedal national identities are undemocratic, and how could we build a democratic identities?
Well, it's frankly a matter of power. You're not going to change the national identity unless you change the nature of the power holders. I think that, if there is some kind of a transition back to a democratically elected government with a reduction of the power of the monarchy, then you can talk about shifting the national identity. And clearly, a lot of it has to do with the role of the monarchy in that identity and whether it's possible to come up with a set of traditions and narratives that all Thai people can share, but that doesn't, involve the centrality of the monarchy to the extent that, it is central right now. But, again, this is this is really an area where a foreigner can't give you much advice because especially on questions of identity, it's such a sensitive topic. You have to be aware of your own history, your own traditions, the symbolism that accompanies, those traditions. And that's something that someone like me is really not going to be able to give you much help with.
Yeah, so I think we just I just want to explore more about on democratic transition. So all of the political science students know modernization theory, right? The notion that once the economic development has produced enough amount of middle class, it will bring about the democratic change. But it seems that with the rise of China, even in Thailand, where the middle class itself is the anti-democratic force, the theory is terribly wrong, I guess, in our opinion. What happened to modernization theory? If not the middle class or economic development, then who or what will be the agent of democratic change, in your opinion?
Well,
in general,
I think that you can still rescue part of modernization theory because it is historically the case that middle classes defined by education more than anything else most often have been the core of support for democratic regimes. The problem is that there's other interests that are at stake, and particularly in a country that is only halfway modernized, where the middle class is not a majority of the country. The middle class can feel threatened by the people below them. And I think that that's probably what was going on with Thaksin in Thailand, where, as I was saying, he represented a more rural, population out in the country, people that were less educated. There was a lot of worry that he would push redistributive programs that would take money from, urban middle class Thais and distribute it to his followers, who are peasants, in the countryside. And I think that fear probably outweighed, the usual demands of educated people to have some share in government. They saw themselves as being threatened. And so as I understand the way the politics in your country worked, that was one of the reasons why there wasn't automatic middle class support for more democracy. But that doesn't mean that that couldn't happen in the future, because, democracy almost never comes from extremely poor people. It really does require, more educated middle class people to bring about.
Oh, thank you, professors. Next, I want to ask about. I would like to go back to populism, because as we are now seeing it, we even in Thailand we are seeing the rise of populists, but it's a right-wing populist in the same trend as in the global trend. So we even Trump out of office. So you say yesterday in Rowing Institute that Trumpism will not go away. We will have to admit that at least 70 million people voted for him in the last elections. So the nation is divided, and it's clear that even though the Trump is not the cause of all the problems, he's just a symptom of something bigger. And you previously said that the globalization is a source of the rise of populism. So could you please elaborate on this point, and what is the connection between globalization, populism, and polarizations?
I think that globalization worked properly in the sense that it made many countries richer. So China and India's rise, was very much connected to their ability to exploit globalization, to export, to other parts of the world. But globalization didn't benefit everybody, and particularly for less educated, less skilled workers in rich countries. I think a lot of them saw their jobs leave for China, for Vietnam, for Thailand, for other parts of Asia. And that's one of the things that I think triggered the backlash that led to the election of Trump and for the vote to Brexit. The other issue that is very sensitive is migration. Globalization was accompanied by lots of people moving across international borders. And in a much more direct way, that threatens people's cultural identity. When they see a lot of people who speak a different language, who have different customs and ways of doing things, possibly different religious views, that triggers a fear on the part of people that they're going to lose their culture. I think that with the Rohingya in Myanmar, that's clearly what's going on. That these are Muslims. They moved into Myanmar, and a lot of native Burmese feel that they're going to be displaced by these people, and that's why you've had such a terrible violent reaction to them. So I think that kind of economic change is the trigger, but I think fundamentally the source is more cultural, that it really does have to do with this lack of understanding between these different cultural groups, between people that are more sophisticated, more educated, able to take advantage of globalization, and those that are less that way. Now, this doesn't it doesn't map onto Thai politics, I think, terribly well, because you don't have this phenomenon of deindustrialization. It's not like you have this huge working class that had been very prosperous at one point and all of a sudden they've lost their jobs, because Thailand really never developed to become a fully industrialized country the way Japan or South Korea are. So you're in a slightly different situation, and therefore, the form of populism that you experience is not going to be the same as the form that exists in the U.S. or in Britain or in other, other rich industrialized countries. Sorry, I'm not hearing you.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear us?
Yes,
good?
now I can.
Okay, so we have next we will have a Q&A sessions. We have audience here at the Faculty of Political Science that would like to have a question with you. So anyone want a question here? Okay, please go and sit here.
Hello. Hi. This is a question from my friend who has to leave a little bit early, but this is concerning American politics and the recent election. So she asked, after the election of Joe Biden, the media war, the media was praising Kamala Harris for being the first Asian African American woman in the office and with such an influential role in American politics. Some can argue that this takes away from her own merit and and achievements as an individual. That her identity takes away from her own merits and achievement as an individual. So how do you think that us or the how do you think that's us or certain perhaps
I think I know where that question is going.
yeah
So I can probably answer something. So again, this refers to this kind of identity politics that I was referring to earlier, where especially among Democrats, there's a feeling that your gender or your ethnicity are really the most important characteristics about you, and that you should choose a vice president based on those, as opposed to picking someone based on their experience or their unique qualifications or something of that sort. And that is one of the reasons that people don't like identity politics, that they feel that people are being advanced simply because of their gender and race and not for other reasons. My view is that it's kind of inevitable that in a diverse country like the United States that these considerations of race and gender are going to be important, because it's not just a question of picking the best qualified candidates. Candidates also have to be representative of the people that voted for them. And the fact of the matter is that, there are many, many women in the United States who were very, very disappointed that Hillary Clinton wasn't elected. Many of them didn't like Hillary Clinton particularly, but they really wanted to have a woman as president. They didn't get that, but they would also like to have a vice president, a female vice president. And I think, that's just a feature of democratic politics, that you do vote for people that represent you because they are similar to you and you feel that they have a better, understanding of your problems and your perspective, and so forth. But it is true that other people then criticize that because you are taking, somebody's external features and characteristics more seriously than they deserve.
Additional question to that. Do you think that the media has sorry, can you hear? Okay, cool. Do you think that the media has overly emphasized certain features or things like race and identity, in their broadcasting or in their address to about the incumbent vice president in general?
The incumbent vice president.
Not the incumbent vice president. I am sorry. Just in general.
I'm not sure that they were playing up that aspect of her that much. I think the more important thing about her was the fact that she did not come out of the left wing of the Democratic Party. There were a lot of people that really wanted Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders to be the candidate, and would have wanted, somebody, whether male or female, that, was willing to say that they were a socialist or they wanted socialism, and a much more left-wing agenda. And I think that Biden picked Kamala Harris not, in fact, he did promise that he'd pick a woman, a black woman, in effect, but I think that the more important choice was the fact that he didn't pick somebody from the left wing of the party. She has a record as a prosecutor, which usually means you're more conservative. She didn't take very strident, left-wing positions when she was running for the presidential nomination. And so I think that actually, the choice was as much over her ideology as over her race and gender. Race and gender were factors, but I don't think it was really the dominant one. It's not as if she's a completely incompetent person that was simply picked just because she was a mixed race woman. I think she does have a very strong record as a senator, as a prosecutor, as a California politician.
In addition to that, do you think that her ideologies and like track record, as in like her work previously as a prosecutor, would aid Biden? Because earlier in the lecture, you also said that Biden will definitely have trouble in his transition in one way or another. Do you think that Kamala Harris will have a significant role in helping bridging kind of like the very polarized Congress that
No, I don't think that she's going to play a big role in bridging that gap, because she's not the sort of politician that would appeal to a kind of white working class, man. The main the main advantage that she has is that she's not Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez or Elizabeth Warren. That's her main qualification, because I think that if Biden had gone for somebody on the left wing of the party, that would have made that person the real target for Republicans. And she's just not going to be a target like that. I think she'll be viewed much more neutrally.
All right, so we have a question from Facebook. Okay, I'm gonna show it to you. How do you envision the foreign affairs and policy from the U.S. under Joe Biden presidency towards Russia? From Kun Nachanat. Okay.
Well, I think it's going to be very different. The Republicans traditionally have been much more anti-Russian until Trump came along. And for some reason, Trump seems to really like Putin. I think nobody really knows why this is the case. I think that there was an article in the New York Times, or a series of articles analyzing his tax returns. And the most plausible theory I can come up with is that he just owes a lot of money to Russians. Personally, he owes a lot of money. And he knows that if he's going to avoid another bankruptcy, he's going to probably have to rely on getting money from Russian sources, because no Western bank at this point is going to lend him $100 million. And so he probably wants to keep that option open. And I think that's as good an explanation as I can think of for why he's been so unwilling to be critical of Putin or of Russia more broadly. And that is obviously not the position that Biden is going to take. He will be much more supportive of Ukraine rather than Russia. I think he will not be tempted to lift sanctions on Russia. I think there's still going to be a very confrontational policy towards Russia under a Biden administration. And there, I think, probably a lot of Republicans will go along with that because I don't think they were all that comfortable with Trump's, closeness to Putin.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Fukuyama. So we have a question from our professor here at Chulalongkorn University. Okay.
Hi, Professor. I'm so excited to have you here with us in this Faculty of Political Science. Thank you so much for coming to enlighten us on various topics. I would like to bring you back to Thai politics a bit. I'm very impressed how you really sharply recommend about building alliance between these middle class students, younger generation, to other generations and other organizations, other classes, especially people outside Bangkok. I myself really see that is very important to mobilize. But I would like to share a bit of insight here as close observer. I think the mood here is more like 18th century France before the revolution. I think the mood and even similar to Russian before revolution, like two ruling class and the mass are totally different. They don't listen to each other. They speak different language, and the ruling class do not realize what's going to take place in the near future. So, what do you think about? Have you any experience or any thought of the atmosphere or the mood of politics, of very old politics, within the context of this global internet era, the social media era, and 21st century technology?
Well, that's very interesting observation. If that's true, then you could be in a rather dangerous situation. I mean, my only experience of that is these historical examples of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution. And if you're in a kind of pre-revolutionary situation, then it seems that forces are going to be unleashed that will then be very difficult to control. And that's a very dangerous position to be in. And as you suggest, it's very hard to build alliances or build consensus in that sort of situation because generally speaking, what happens in a revolution is that the revolution keeps escalating so that, the people that are seen as extremists on Monday are seen as moderates on Tuesday, and then they're seen as reactionaries on Wednesday, and as time goes on, demands keep escalating until you get to a point where then they're reversed and there's a counter-revolutionary wave and so forth. I hope that doesn't happen in Thailand, but you'll have to tell me whether, any of these scenarios are plausible.
In fact, pretty close. We have really swing, mood. On Monday, one thing happened. At night, we couldn't sleep because, the king himself moved in the late afternoon of the previous day, and the next morning, student announced something. So that's kind of, swing back and forth as well. Quite dangerous.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Professor Wiengrat, for your insightful question and comments on our situation here in Thailand. So I think this will be the last question. So just anyone on Facebook Live and YouTube Live, you can type in your question in the comment section now. And yeah, so let's see.
So one last question then, if you don't get any question from Facebook Live. So I want to end with the broader trend of global democracy. About what do you think about the future democracy in the next, like, let's say 5 years or under Biden the 4 years will get better, or what would it take to fix that?
Well, I think that there's some reason for optimism, beginning with the United States. I think that it's very important that American voters rejected Donald Trump. I think it means that the United States will start reinserting itself internationally as a force for democracy, and I think that's pretty important. The thing that I worry about is really the pandemic, because this is not so true in Asia, where you've managed to control it much better. But in Europe, in North America, in Latin America, in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in all these regions, the pandemic is going to be extended, and it's going to lead to a prolonged economic slowdown, and many developing countries are going to be going backwards in terms of lifting people out of poverty and so forth. And that's not a good situation in itself, and it's also politically potentially very destabilizing. And we can see this already in Europe and the United States. There are these mass protests against being shut down, because after 9 months, people are really sick of having to stay home and not being able to return to their normal lives. And that is potentially a dangerous challenge for democratic countries. So, it's very hard to predict. I think we're going through a very tricky time, and, I think it's probably better not to make predictions, but rather to think about alternative scenarios for the future so that you can prepare yourself for whatever actually does happen.
All right, so I think this is the real last question from our Facebook Live. From Shamil Katya Ari, how do you think the US or certain parties could reduce the extreme obsession with identity, race, and ethnicity in politics?
Well, I think that, this is one of those things that simply requires a little bit of leadership. I think that if you have leaders that actually want to build understanding between races and don't want to increase the degree of polarization, then, that will go some way to healing that problem. I mean, the problem is that for the last 4 years, we've had a leader who actually wanted to widen the gap and to increase people's fears about the other side. And, that's the one respect in which I'm hopeful about a Biden administration, because he's signaled very clearly that he's not going to do that. He keeps talking in terms of not red Americans and blue Americans, but, just Americans. And I think that that message is, probably going to resonate with a lot of people who are tired of being set against each other. So, that's my hope for, what might happen in the coming years.
Professors, I think we are running out of time, so it's our absolute honor for you to be with us today, Professor Fukuyama. If you ever come to Thailand, so please don't forget to visit us at the university. We would love to see you in person. Okay, so we would love to listen to your lectures about democracy and global politics. But for this time, we would like to thank you again for joining us, and have a good day. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. It was very good to talk to you.
Thank you, Miss. All right, please come to Thailand after COVID-19.
And good luck with all of your political struggles.
Yeah.
Okay, so long.
Farewell. ก็จบไปแล้วนะครับสำหรับเซสชั่นกับ คุณฟรานซิสฟุกุยาม่านะครับก็สำหรับครั้งต่อไปจะเป็นใครนะครับแล้วก็จะมีกิจกรรมอะไรเกิดขึ้นนะครับโปรดติดตามที่เพจสโมสรนิสิตคณะรัฐศาสตร์จุฬานะครับแล้วก็ขอบคุณนะครับขอบคุณครับso สำหรับใครที่อยากสนับสนุนกิจกรรมดีๆนะครับเราก็มีช่องทางนะครับสามารถสนับสนุนเรานะครับได้ทางนี้นะครับมีเลขที่บัญชีขึ้นกับ QR code นะครับสามารถสแกนได้นะครับหรือว่าเพื่อ funding our program นะครับโอเคครับก็สำหรับวันนี้ก็ขอบคุณทุกคนนะครับที่ติดตามรับชมนะครับหรือว่าคนที่มาดูย้อนหลังนะครับสามารถคอมเมนต์ทิ้งไว้ได้นะครับว่าอยากให้ใครมาหรือว่าอยากคุยกับใครในประเด็นอะไรต่อนะครับก็สำหรับวันนี้ก็ขอลาไปก่อนนะครับผมสุพนัทกับ
รัชพงศ์ครับก็สวัสดีครับสวัสดีครับ